Americans are reckoning with the electoral choices they made last fall. Every day brings new crisis, new chaos, new fears and anxieties as Donald Trump's autocracy takes root. And for many of those Americans, this wasn't what they wanted, right? They may have voted for Trump thinking they were getting something else. They may have sat out the election thinking that both candidates were the same or that both parties were the same and that the system was broken. But this isn't what people wanted. And that's starting to come out. I think people are really starting to understand that what was sold to them by the Trump MAGA campaign was very different from what Project 2025 under Donald Trump is delivering. But it's critical that we not only look forward, as important as it is to think about the building strategies, the network building, and community building across silos that we need to engage in to get out of this, to build back, to make a future that is better than the one that came before it. It's critical that we look back and really digest, really understand how we strayed so far to get to a point that America elected this fascist autocrat. And to dig into that type of deep reflection, I was just thrilled to see this incredible work from our friends at Way to Win, which is a donor network that focuses on developing data driven and movement focused strategies for driving real systemic change. And, of course, in the aftermath of an election, there's always a lot of takes about, why this happened, how did the Democrats screw this up? How did folks do this wrong? But what I really appreciated about what Way to Win is doing here is it's rich. They're listening to people, and I'm so thrilled to bring you all in here today to dig into what you're doing because it's so important. Jenifer Ancona and Dan Ancona from Way to Win, thank you for joining us. Thank you for this work you're doing. Surveys and focus groups with really carefully curated sets of voters, really important, uh, groups of voters that were determinative in the outcome of this election, to try to think through what happened, how were they processing what happened here, or what was at stake last fall, and what can we do to start to bring them back in. What were the top lines of your initial findings? Who have you talked to, and what are you finding about why so many Biden voters ended up either voting for Donald Trump or not voting at all?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks so much for having us. I'll start by saying we wanted to dig into the particular audience, like you said, of people who had voted for Biden in 2020 and then didn't vote in 2024. We know it was many millions of people, and we know that this election was a bit unique compared to other elections in the Trump era, where we saw, extremely high turnout and record turnout among those groups. And so there was something that happened in this election that caused Democrats to lose those voters. But because there were also some voters who switched to Trump, it makes it look like it's a whole rightward shift to Trump if you don't dig in to the, specifics of these voters. And it's important, as you said at the top, to understand that this wasn't just a rightward shift towards Trump and the MAGA agenda. It was also a shift away from a Democratic Party that people have become very disappointed in for reasons that we'll talk about. So I'll start with just the who. We talked with young people under 35 of mixed race, so young people across the board, Latinos of all ages, voting ages, and Latinas, so men and women, different groups, and then Black men. So that was our first round. And we chose those groups because those were the most pronounced in the voter file data that we looked at in terms of people who voted in 2020 and then skipped in 2024. I'll give a quick top line and then have Dan chime in a bit more. But the discourse, as you said, all the hot takes that happen after the election have been really oriented around this idea about it's the groups and it's progressives and it's, people too woke, woke
Well,
is too woke, that
yeah.
has really been a dominant narrative. And as we listen to these voters, our big takeaway is that they didn't skip voting in 24, which had an impact in who got, who won, because they viewed Kamala Harris as too liberal or too woke. And the vast majority of them, if they showed up, they would not have voted for Trump. But as I said, they're deeply disappointed in the Democratic Party. They're skeptical of government and the political process, and they feel out of control, and they feel that their lives have not been improved despite the fact that they have been voting for Democrats. And so that is kind of the big top line takeaway.
Yeah, I was taken by a quote that you gave in a Rolling Stone piece that recently covered your work here, and you just sort of touched on it in your answer just now. You said it's not a question of left versus center, which is the question that has dominated the discourse. It's really a question of, are you going to fight for me, or are you going to fold and capitulate? There's
Mhm.
this other dynamic, right? Are you for the oligarchs and the status quo, or are you for disrupting these systems that have not worked for me, or helping me to get a better life? That's the crux. And it seems so clear from the way that Democrats are even processing the cascading crises of today that they're not getting the memo on this. They want to talk about the rule of law, the institutions, even concepts like due process, as important and critically important, fundamental as something like due process is. What does that mean when it's disconnected from people's lives, where, as you said, I think in a different quote in the piece, my life sucks. This isn't a game, right? Fight
Yeah.
for this, fight for us. It
Yeah.
just feels like, actually, and then Dan, I want to turn to you, but I shared some of your analysis and the Rolling Stone article with a friend of mine who's not in politics today.
Mm.
Kind of want to pull up the text, but he was like, "How is this so hard for people to get? This is exactly it, right?" He's checked out completely from the Democrats, and he says, "Burn the whole party down and build something better and new."
Yeah. Yeah. Dan, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is, one of the clearest signals that we've gotten about these voters is that they just want to change. Like there was, if so to put in a plug, we do have a whole podcast with a bunch of the sound. Charting the Way Forward is, we're on Substack, we're on YouTube, and we're on all the podcast places.
Man, thank you
Uh,
for doing that. I meant to do that earlier, and I also meant to tell folks to like and subscribe to this channel. I'm still working on it.
Definitely, yes. Like and
Like and
subscribe.
subscribe
It's
to
really
this
important,
one
people.
Either
It
way,
first.
I'm
actually
trying to
it
send
makes
them.
a huge difference, right? We're all guerrilla marketers here, and we're putting out good stuff here. Look, they just so want to change, and like the words that sort of came out, because the way that we analyze this data is, me in particular, I spent hours going over it. We all listen to them like as they're happening, so that's 8 hours of listening to it. And then, in the software you use, you can actually sort of mark the clips that sort of jump out at you. So we download all the 30 clips to 40 clips for some of them in each thing. And then we sort of built a structure of what these people were really saying out of those clips from the ground up. And like the words that came out of it were disappointed. They're disappointed in the Democrats, in the country, especially like the black men. It's some of the clips are just heartbreaking. Like people, they're just disappointed in where things have gone, like for understandable reasons, demoralized. A lot of them felt actually like their vote had been taken away. Even they felt like they'd been disenfranchised, even by the way the whole process worked, and especially by the particular lack of the primary, which surprised us. We were not anticipating to find that clear of a signal around that, but people were really frustrated by this. So it all adds up, and it's just it's a this we've got a lot of feedback to the Rolling Stone article and everything of people saying, I'm assuming we can curse on this. It's a political podcast. Sort of the median response has been, fuck these people, fuck these voters. We don't need them. And like, I just, I mean, we at Way to Win, we're organizers, right? And like all of us, I think when I started out organizing, I think, my initial approach was like, I know how to do these things, right? And like, dude, if you are an organizer and you start organizing from that point of view, you don't last very long. It breaks down your ego, and that whole approach just doesn't work. So this is why we went out and started listening to people, and trying to start with where they're at, really listening to them, trying to build this understanding of them from the ground up.
Yeah, and I'm interested. I'd love to ask you about sort of where you see these learnings taking us going forward. Because, again, looking back quickly, I'm thinking about the period I spent working for Democrats in the Senate, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and particularly that transitional period after Trump tried to steal the 2020 election. He was thankfully thwarted in that effort, and then Democrats assumed a trifecta, right? People, it's hard to even imagine at this point. But on January 6th, we got the surprise news that both Georgia Senate seats were going to go blue, and we were going to have a 50-seat majority in the Senate. and Biden came in, and it seemed like there was just a tremendous potential for change. Obviously, there were some real substantial obstacles in terms of what that trifecta looked like in terms of its actual political willingness to deliver results for people. But the mentality was just like, let's go back to the way things were before this all happened and pretend it never happened, and build back these institutions that, if we're all being honest, weren't serving people very well before Donald Trump came into power in the first place. A big part of probably why Donald Trump won power in 2016 over Hillary Clinton, and a lot of these same sentiments that I think people attach to Clinton. So it strikes me that if we are fortunate enough to get through this period of darkness and have opportunity to build down the road, we're going to
Yeah.
need a completely different approach when we once again wield levers of real power.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a completely different approach on a lot of levels. And one of the things that we wanted to do with these groups of voters was actually test out like a worldview kind of question. So, we know that we know what the Republican worldview is, and there was a story in the election of 2024 that was very strong coming from the Republicans. We called it the big lie of 2024 because the big lie of 2020 was Trump won the election. The big lie of 2024 was Democrats don't care about you; they only care about XYZ other group. They care about LGBTQ, trans. They care about immigrants more than you. They care about Ukraine, more than you. That all of those narratives were sinking deep into these communities for a long time, for 2 to 3 years before the election. And then when it came to the election, there was that one famous ad campaign with the trans issue saying, Donald Trump cares about you, Kamala Harris cares about they, them, using that clip of her, right? That was, it's so painful, but that also wasn't just a trans issue. It was actually a deep worldview issue that they had been laying the groundwork for years. So we wanted to test that up against what our theory had been coming out of the election, which is that everyone says it's about inflation. It's about inflation. It's about prices. That is true. That is somewhat true. But there's a deeper story there that was not really told in this election. That's about talking about the fact that we have an economic system where the richest 1%, 0.01% have literally taken 50 trillion in wealth from the rest of us, the other 90% of us, over the past 5 decades, whether it's through tax cuts for wealthy people, privatized healthcare, squashing unions, and doing it all while dividing us by our differences. So that's sort of what we think is like the worldview that people need to hear right now, and that was not a part of the election story from Biden all the way through to Harris. And that deep kind of populist, like explaining to people why things are bad, not just telling them, I'm going to give you a middle class tax cut. It's like, that's not, I'm going to give you a middle class tax cut is just not where people are, on the whole, especially this group. So when we tested through all these focus groups, do you think this is the reason for all of our problems, or this is the reason? It was like almost unanimous that people chose the economic system being deeply unfair and unequal.
Just to say that the alternative that we tested, and
Right.
we didn't know how this was going to go,
Yeah.
was the problem is government spending, and the problem is going too far with wokeness, and the problem, I forget, we had
Too many immigrants,
too many, oh,
DEI,
immigrants, right? Exactly. Like
yeah,
we put the whole thing in there,
out
right?
of
And
control
like
government spending. Yeah.
right, we wanted this to be a fair test, and like we tried to make their case, in a fair way, and I think we did a pretty good job of it. And it just with this group of voters, I mean, we're going to do some polling, and I would love to do some national polling of like all the different groups and see how they
Yeah.
went. We'll get to that hopefully, or I don't know, maybe we need to stop talking about 2024 at some point here and move on. But we're going to test this for more, for
Well,
sure.
because I think it's
Right?
a grounding for
Yeah,
2026 and 2028. It's like, it's not just looking
yeah,
backwards. Like, it's like this narrative is popping off. That's why
yeah.
36,000 people went to the Bernie and AOC Fight the Oligarchy rally. And they're showing up in thousands in places like Montana and Idaho. And it's like there's something in the country that wants this kind of narrative. And the Democrats have been unwilling or unable to really carry it forward. And that's kind of the point of us bringing this up, is that if we're going to go forward into the next cycle, we have to understand that this is where we are. We are not going to be able to win over these voters or the writ large most voters with a kind of this business as usual strategy.
Yeah, that's becoming really clear really quickly. And I agree with your assessment that the Democratic Party broadly seems sort of unable to make this switch, like to recognize that we are living in a fundamentally changed political paradigm, that the old ideals, things like bipartisanship, like, is that something people care about in terms of like voter choice? Are they going to be rewarded for this stuff?
It's a little complicated, right? Because if you go and ask voters, like, do you like bipartisanship or do you like moderation, right? They'll say, of course, we like moderates. We
Yeah,
love
they say
moderates.
they like it.
Right. But like, then it's like,
But
and it's hard to figure this out, right? Because they do want, like, they're also very aware of the things that are not going well in their lives and, like, that are challenging in this country. And like,
I don't think they care about bipartisanship. I think it's like what they care about is, are you making a stand? Are you actually fighting for me? Do you have a backbone? I want to see action, not just talk. That's overriding in the signals we get from this group of voters that we were talking to is like bipartisanship didn't come up at all. I mean, had we asked them, do you like bipartisanship? They probably would have been like, sure. But it didn't naturally arise in terms of like when we asked them, what are you looking for Democrats? Literally none of them said bipartisanship or working together with the other side. Someone literally said, whoever punches Trump in the face first will get my vote. So
not to advocate violence.
Not at all.
I mean, it's a voter. He wasn't serious.
He wasn't serious, right? But like metaphorically, we need to be punching this guy in the face every day,
exactly.
right? Because the fact that nobody's willing to metaphorically punch him in the face is giving him all the leeway he needs to continue to trample over our rights and freedoms in our lives. And I think that's right. In this bipartisanship conversation, it touches on this point we talked about earlier. This isn't a left-right thing. And despite this ossification of the big D Democratic Party, we're starting to see these emergent leaders who aren't necessarily coded in terms of left-right. You've got these traditionally, progressively branded legislators like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I think is claiming this mantle in the fight against oligarchy and delivering a really powerful populist message that we see resonating in red states at these huge rallies.
Yeah.
But then also she's sort of having she apologized and is breaking bread and forging strategy with somebody like Connor Lamb, who progressives rejected as an alternative to John Fetterman. And look how that turned
out.
Yeah. So I think.
No, and I think AOC has been saying that very directly in the rallies. Like, this isn't about left versus right. You can be a Republican, you can be a Democrat. We all have to fight the oligarchy.
Yeah. And there's so much that Americans agree on, right? That's another thing we can take away from this. It's like we have all of this, even as propaganda and partisan polarization has divided us around these culture wars that they have literally concocted out of thin air.
Yeah.
The underlying stuff, the stuff that people really go home and worry about and think about and talk about late at night when their kids are asleep, those are common interests that some party needs to be able to speak to. Jenifer and Dan, thank you so much for joining me here today, for doing this extraordinary work. I want to recommend folks follow that podcast, Charting the Way Forward. Did I get it right?
That's it.
And check out Way to Win's incredible work. Thank you so much again. And this is not like over yet. You guys are still doing more research, and there's launching some more public stuff in May. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we're launching a big national poll. We'll look into these different subgroups. We'll have more focus groups after that too. So it'll be a bigger package that we'll release in May. And the podcast is a way to keep being able to listen as we get new stuff.
Wonderful. And would love to have you back to dig into more of your findings as they come to light. Thanks again for joining us. Everybody, thank you for taking your time here with us today. Until next time, stay mad, stay motivated, stay mighty.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.